What happens when Hollywood's toughest legend goes head-to-head with one of morning television's most persistent hosts? It only took 33 seconds for things to explode on Good Morning America. Before we get into this insane confrontation, make sure you hit that subscribe button. We bring you daily videos exposing Hollywood's darkest scandals, the confrontations they don't want you to see, and the moments that get buried by the morning after. Now let's get into what happened last night. The Good Morning America studio was buzzing with energy as Clint Eastwood walked onto the set. At 84 years old, the legendary actor and director still commanded respect wherever he went. He'd been invited to discuss his latest film project, but what started as a simple conversation quickly turned into one of the most explosive moments in morning television history. George Stephanopoulos greeted Eastwood with his usual professional smile, shaking his hand before they both sat down across from each other. The cameras rolled, the audience watched, and everything seemed normal for about 3 minutes. So Clint, your new film deals with some pretty heavy themes about American values, George began, his tone measured and calm. Some critics have said your portrayal feels like it's stuck in the past. How do you respond to that? Eastwood shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening just slightly. Critics can say whatever the hell they want. I make films about real people, real struggles. Not everyone needs to agree with me. George nodded, but there was something in his expression that suggested he wasn't satisfied with that answer. Sure, but don't you think filmmakers have a responsibility to reflect modern values? To show progress? Progress? Eastwood's voice had an edge now. What kind of progress are we talking about here, George? The kind where everyone gets a trophy for showing up? Where we pretend everyone's a winner, even when they're not? A few uncomfortable laughs rippled through the studio audience. George's smile tightened, becoming more forced. I'm talking about representation. About making sure all voices are heard in your storytelling. Your films tell stories about America, but they only seem to tell them from one perspective. All voices are heard when they have something worth saying. Eastwood shot back. I don't make films by committee. I make them based on what I believe is true. What I've seen in this country over 8 decades of living in it. George leaned forward, his reporter instincts kicking in. But Clint, your films have been criticized for lacking diversity, for presenting a very specific worldview that many people find outdated. Don't you think that's a valid concern? Don't you think you have a blind spot here? Eastwood's eyes narrowed dangerously. You know what I find outdated, George? Being told how to think, what to say, who to cast by people who wouldn't know authenticity if it hit them in the face. I've been making films for 50 years. I think I know what the hell I'm doing. Nobody's questioning your experience, George said, his voice taking on a sharper tone. But experience doesn't make you immune to criticism. Your last 3 films have had predominantly white, male casts. In today's Hollywood, in today's America, that's not just noticeable, it's problematic. There's that word again, Eastwood said with a harsh laugh. Problematic. Everything's problematic these days. In today's Hollywood, people are more worried about checking boxes and pleasing Twitter than telling good stories. You want me to cast someone just because of what they look like? That's the definition of discrimination, George. George sat back, his expression shifting from professional interviewer to something more confrontational. So you're saying diversity in casting is discrimination? That's a pretty explosive statement, Clint. Are you seriously comparing efforts to increase representation to discrimination? Don't twist my goddamn words, Eastwood said, pointing a finger at George. I'm saying I cast the best person for the role. Period. I don't care what color they are, where they're from, or what's between their legs. But I'm not going to be forced into decisions by people who've never made a damn film in their lives, who don't understand what it takes to tell a story that actually means something. The tension in the studio was thick enough to cut with a knife. Audience members glanced at each other nervously. The production crew behind the cameras exchanged worried looks. One camera operator zoomed in closer, sensing this was becoming something bigger than anyone anticipated. But that's just it, Clint, George pressed, his voice getting louder. You say you cast the best person, but somehow the best person is almost always a white man. Doesn't that strike you as statistically impossible? Doesn't that suggest maybe, just maybe, you have some unconscious bias? Eastwood's face flushed red. Unconscious bias? Are you seriously psychoanalyzing me right now? You don't know a damn thing about my process, about how I choose actors, about what goes into making these decisions. George pressed on. But isn't that the problem? You're making these decisions in a vacuum, without considering how your work impacts people, how it represents our society. Our society? Eastwood's voice was cold now. George, when's the last time you left your studio and actually talked to regular Americans? Not politicians, not celebrities, regular working people? I interview people from all walks of life, George responded defensively. You interview people who fit your narrative, Eastwood countered. You sit here in your comfortable chair, asking loaded questions, trying to trap people into saying what you want them to say. That's not journalism. That's activism. George's face flushed slightly. I'm doing my job, Clint. I'm asking questions that viewers want answers to. If you can't handle that, maybe you shouldn't have agreed to come on the show. Handle it? Eastwood let out a harsh laugh. Kid, I've been handling tougher situations than this since before you were born. What I can't handle is this self-righteous attitude, this assumption that you and your network know what's best for everyone. George pressed on, leaning even further forward, his eyes narrowing. But isn't that the problem? You're making these decisions based on an old Hollywood mentality, without considering how your work impacts people, how it represents our society today. The world has changed, Clint, even if you haven't. Our society? Eastwood's voice was ice cold now, each word deliberate. George, when's the last time you left your studio and actually talked to regular Americans? Not politicians, not celebrities, not activists with agendas. Regular working people who go to work, pay their bills, raise their kids, and don't spend all day worrying about whether a movie has the right ratio of ethnicities in the cast? I interview people from all walks of life every single day, George responded defensively, his face starting to redden. That's literally my job. You interview people who fit your narrative, Eastwood countered, his voice rising with each word. You sit here in your comfortable chair in your comfortable studio in New York City, asking loaded questions, trying to trap people into saying what you want them to say so you can get your viral moment. That's not journalism, George. That's activism dressed up as news, and everyone with half a brain can see right through it. George's face flushed deeper, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. That's incredibly insulting. I'm doing my job, Clint. I'm asking questions that viewers want answers to, questions that matter to millions of Americans. If you can't handle that, if you can't defend your choices, maybe you shouldn't have agreed to come on the show. Handle it? Eastwood let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed through the studio. Kid, I've been handling tougher situations than this since before you were born. I've dealt with studio executives trying to kill my projects. I've dealt with censors. I've dealt with critics trying to tear apart everything I make for 50 goddamn years. What I can't handle, what I won't handle, is this self-righteous, holier-than-thou attitude, this assumption that you and your network and your little bubble of commentators know what's best for everyone, that you have the moral high ground on every issue. This isn't about me or the network, George said, his voice rising to match Eastwood's intensity, veins starting to show on his neck. This is about you defending creative choices that many people, millions of people, find problematic. It's about you refusing to even acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, you could do better. Problematic, Eastwood repeated, shaking his head in disgust, his voice dripping with contempt. That's the word you people love, isn't it? Everything's problematic. Everything needs to be examined under a microscope, criticized, torn apart, apologized for, groveled over. Whatever happened to just letting art be art? Whatever happened to telling stories without having to worry about offending every possible group on the planet? Art doesn't exist in a vacuum, Clint, George insisted, his jaw clenched tight. Leaning so far forward he was almost standing. It influences culture. It shapes perspectives. It affects how people see themselves and others in society. You of all people, with your platform, with your decades of influence, should understand that power and the responsibility that comes with wielding it. I understand that power just fine, Eastwood said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried through the entire studio. What I don't understand is why I'm being lectured about responsibility and ethics by someone who reads off a teleprompter for a living, who's never created anything original in his entire career, who just regurgitates whatever his producers tell him to say. The audience gasped audibly. Several people covered their mouths in shock. George's expression went from annoyed to genuinely furious, his face turning a deep shade of red. "Excuse me? What the hell did you just say to me?" "You heard me perfectly clear," Eastwood said, not backing down an inch. His eyes locked on George's with an intensity that could cut steel. "You want to talk about impact? About responsibility? About contribution to society? At least when I make a film, I'm creating something real. I'm building something from nothing, putting my vision, my soul into it. I'm not just recycling talking points that someone handed me that morning, that some producer wrote for me in a back room before the show." George stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, the sound reverberating through the silent studio. "That's incredibly disrespectful, Clint. That's crossing a line. I've been a journalist for decades. I've covered wars in the Middle East. I've covered presidential elections. I've covered major world events that actually changed history and affected people's lives. Don't you dare sit there and diminish what I do. Don't you dare suggest that I'm just some puppet reading lines. Then don't diminish what I do," Eastwood fired back, also rising from his seat. Both men now standing and facing each other across the desk like boxers in a ring. "You invited me here supposedly to talk about my film. But all you want to do is put me on trial for not making the movies you think I should make, for not following your political agenda, for not bowing down to your ideology, for not apologizing for being who I am. I'm asking you to take responsibility," George shouted, his composure completely gone now, his voice cracking with emotion. "To acknowledge that your work has influence, and that influence comes with responsibility to all Americans. Not just the ones who think like you, not just the ones who look like you." The studio went dead silent. Even the camera operators stopped moving, frozen in place. The boom mic operators' hands were shaking. Everyone in the room knew George had just crossed a major line, had made this intensely personal. Eastwood's face went dark, his voice deadly quiet, but somehow more threatening than when he was yelling. "What the hell did you just say to me? Say that again. I want to make sure I heard you correctly." George realized he'd gone too far, but pride wouldn't let him back down now. His voice wavered slightly, but he pushed forward. "I said what I said. Your films represent a very narrow, very specific view of America. And when anyone calls you on it, when anyone dares to question your choices, you get defensive and hostile instead of listening. Instead of considering that maybe the criticism has merit." "Narrow view?" Eastwood's hands were trembling with barely contained rage, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the desk. "I've made films about everything from jazz musicians to war heroes to wrongly accused men on death row. I've told stories that span decades, that cover every corner of this country, from the coasts to the heartland. But because I don't make them the way you want, because I don't cast them according to your checklist, because I don't insert your political messages into every scene, suddenly I have a narrow view." "That's bullshit, George, and you know it." "Your defensiveness is proving my point," George said, trying desperately to regain control of the situation, but failing miserably, his voice shaking. "You can't even have a conversation about this without losing your temper, without attacking me personally." "You're damn right I'm angry," Eastwood exploded, slamming his own hand on the desk with enough force to make the microphones jump. I'm angry because I came here in good faith, expecting to talk about my work, about my craft, about something I've dedicated my entire goddamn life to. Instead, I get ambushed by someone who thinks he's morally superior, who thinks he has the right to judge me, to lecture me about how I should think and work and create, like I'm some student who needs to be corrected. Nobody's ambushing you, George protested. But his voice lacked any conviction now, the uncertainty clear on his face. These are legitimate questions that need to be asked in the current cultural climate. If you can't answer them without losing your temper, without getting hostile, that's on you, not me. Legitimate questions? Eastwood's laugh was cruel, mocking. There's nothing legitimate about this hit piece you're trying to do. You're not interested in my answers. You never were from the moment I walked onto this set. You're interested in my reactions. You want me to say something inflammatory? Something you can clip and share, and use to prove whatever point you're trying to make to your audience of people who already agree with everything you say before you even say it. George's face was bright red now, veins visible on his forehead and neck, sweat beginning to form. If you feel ambushed, Clint, maybe that's because you're not used to being challenged anymore. Maybe you're so used to everyone in Hollywood treating you like royalty, like some untouchable icon who can do no wrong, that you can't handle someone asking you tough questions about your choices, about your impact on culture. Tough questions? Eastwood's voice was venomous, each word like a knife. You want to ask me tough questions? Ask me about directing. Ask me about the technical challenges of making films on location in difficult conditions. Ask me about working with actors, about cinematography, about editing, about the actual craft I've spent my entire life perfecting and mastering. But don't sit there in your expensive suit behind your expensive desk and lecture me about morality and social responsibility, like you're some kind of moral authority, like you're better than me, like you have the answers to everything. I never said I was better than you, George said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now, a crack in his armor. You didn't have to say it out loud, Eastwood spat, his contempt palpable. It's in every word you've spoken since I sat down. It's in every question you've asked. It's written all over your face. You think you're on the right side of history. You think you're enlightened and I'm some relic from a bygone era who needs to be educated, who needs to be brought into the modern age. Well, let me tell you something, George. I've lived through more history than you've read about in books. I've seen this country at its best and its worst. And I sure as hell don't need lessons from you or anyone else on this network. This isn't about lessons, George said, his voice cracking audibly now, the strain showing. This is about accountability, about using your massive platform responsibly, about understanding the impact your work has on society. My platform? Eastwood's eyes blazed with fury. I built my platform through decades of hard work, through taking risks that scared the hell out of me, through failing and getting back up, through creating things that people actually wanted to see, that meant something to them. I didn't get handed a cushy job at a network because I had the right connections or the right political views or because I agreed to push a certain narrative. I earned every damn thing I have through blood, sweat, and tears. That's not fair, George protested weakly. Fair? Eastwood's voice rose to a near shout. You want to talk about fair? Nothing about this interview has been fair. You ambushed me, you attacked my integrity, you questioned my motives, and now you're acting like the victim when I push back. That's rich, George. That's really rich. The two men stood, facing each other, the desk between them suddenly seeming insignificant. The studio audience was completely silent, barely breathing. Some people looked like they wanted to leave, but were too frozen to move. George took a shaky breath, trying one more time to steer this back to something resembling a professional interview. Clint, I think we need to take a step back here and— No, Eastwood interrupted sharply, his voice like a whip crack. You want to step back now because you're realizing this isn't going the way you planned. You thought you'd get me on here, ask your gotcha questions, make me look like some old dinosaur who doesn't get it, and everyone would applaud you for taking down the mighty Clint Eastwood. Well, I get it just fine, George. I get that you're more interested in scoring points with your viewers than having a real honest conversation. That's not true, George protested. But the words sounded hollow even to him. I'm trying to have a substantive discussion about important cultural issues. Substantive? Eastwood scoffed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. There's nothing substantive about this goddamn ambush. You're not interested in my answers. You're interested in my reactions. You want me to say something you can clip for social media, something controversial you can use to drive ratings and get people talking about your show. You want me to give you a moment, and you know what? I'm not going to do it. George's face was crimson now, his anger barely contained, his professional mask completely shattered. If you feel ambushed, Clint, maybe that's because you're not used to being challenged anymore. Maybe you're so used to everyone in Hollywood kissing your ass, treating you like royalty, like some untouchable legend, that you can't handle someone actually asking you tough questions about the impact of your work. Tough questions? Eastwood's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper again. You want to ask me tough questions? Ask me about directing actors through difficult emotional scenes. Ask me about the challenges of filming in extreme conditions. Ask me about budget constraints and studio pressure and all the real problems filmmakers face. But don't sit there and lecture me about morality and social responsibility like you're some kind of authority figure, like you've earned the right to judge me. I have every right to ask these questions, George said firmly, trying to summon some authority back into his voice. This is my show. These are issues that matter to our audience, to millions of Americans watching right now. Your audience, Eastwood repeated with disgust. Right. The audience that agrees with everything you say before you even say it. The audience that nods along to every opinion you present as fact. The echo chamber you've built for yourself. God forbid someone comes on here with a different perspective, with a different way of seeing the world. God forbid you actually have a guest who doesn't just agree with everything you believe. George slammed both hands on the desk between them, the sound like thunder in the silent studio. That's enough. You don't get to come on my show and attack me personally, attack my integrity, attack my profession, just because you don't like the questions I'm asking. And you don't get to invite me on your show just to tear me down, just to make yourself look good, Eastwood shot back, his voice matching George's volume. If you wanted a yes man, if you wanted someone who would just sit here and agree with everything you said, you should have invited someone else. You should have invited one of those Hollywood types who's more worried about being liked than being honest. Maybe I should have, George said coldly, his voice shaking with rage. Because clearly you're not capable of having an adult conversation about your work without getting defensive and hostile, without attacking everyone around you. Eastwood stood up fully now, his full height towering over the desk, his presence dominating the studio. Hostile? You want to see hostile, George? You haven't seen anything yet. But you're about to see me walk out of here, because I don't need this crap. I don't need to sit here and be lectured by someone half my age who thinks he knows everything. I've got better things to do than be your punching bag for ratings. Fine, George shouted, also standing fully, both men now squared off. If you can't handle a little criticism, if you can't defend your choices like an adult, then maybe you should leave. Maybe you should run away like you always do when things get difficult. A little criticism? Eastwood's laugh was harsh and bitter. This wasn't criticism, George. This was a character assassination. This was a hit job. You had your mind made up about me before I even walked through that door. You had your narrative written before we started filming. I was just supposed to play my part in your little morality play. The door's right there, George said, pointing with a shaking hand. If you want to run away, instead of defending your positions, if you want to avoid accountability, go ahead. I'm sure your fans will eat it up. Another story about how unfair the mainstream media is to conservatives. I'm not running from anything, Eastwood said, his voice like steel, cold and unyielding. I'm walking away from a waste of my time. From a person who isn't interested in truth. only in validation of his worldview. There's a huge difference, and if you can't see that, you're even more lost than I thought. He reached down and unclipped his microphone, the harsh ripping sound of the Velcro loud in the tense silence. He tossed it onto the chair without ceremony, the equipment clattering against the hard surface. The studio was in complete shock, cameras still rolling, capturing every moment of the complete meltdown. George stood frozen for a moment, his face a mixture of anger, disbelief, and something that might have been fear of what this meant for his career. So that's it? You're just going to storm off? You're just going to prove everyone right about you? Prove everyone right? Eastwood turned back, his eyes blazing. The only thing I'm proving is that I won't be bullied, I won't be shamed. I won't apologize for being who I am and making the films I make. If that makes me the bad guy in your story, so be it. I'll sleep just fine tonight. Pathetic, George muttered, but loud enough for the microphones to catch. I'm going to leave with my dignity intact, Eastwood replied. Which is more than you can say after this pathetic excuse for an interview. Pathetic? George's voice cracked slightly. You're the one who couldn't handle a simple discussion about representation in film. There was nothing simple about it, Eastwood said, turning back toward George one last time. You wanted a confession. You wanted me to apologize for making films the way I make them. Well, I won't apologize. Not to you, not to anyone. Nobody asked you to apologize, George said, but his voice lacked conviction now. Didn't you? Eastwood challenged. Every question was designed to make me admit I was wrong, that I needed to change, that my way of doing things was somehow harmful. That's not an interview, George. That's an interrogation. The two men stared at each other across the studio, neither willing to back down. The audience sat in stunned silence, unsure whether to applaud, gasp, or just stay quiet. I think we're done here, Eastwood said finally, his voice exhausted. Good luck with your show, George. I hope whoever you get next is more willing to play along. He turned and walked toward the exit, his footsteps echoing in the silent studio. George called after him, Clint, wait! But Eastwood didn't stop, didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge the plea. As he reached the studio door, one of the producers rushed over, trying to say something, but Eastwood brushed past them. The heavy door swung open, and just before it closed behind him, he looked back one last time at George, who was still standing by his desk, looking shaken and angry. You know what your problem is, George, Eastwood said, his voice carrying across the studio one final time. You think asking tough questions makes you brave. But real bravery is standing by your convictions, even when everyone's trying to tear you down. You might want to think about that. With those final words, Clint Eastwood walked out of the Good Morning America studio, leaving behind one of the most explosive confrontations in morning television history. The door slammed shut behind him, the sound reverberating through the silent studio like a gunshot. George Stephanopoulos stood there, his carefully constructed professional demeanor completely shattered, as the cameras continued to roll and the audience sat in stunned, uncomfortable silence. The interview that was supposed to be a promotional opportunity had turned into a full-scale war of words, ending with one of Hollywood's biggest legends walking off the set. The confrontation lasted only a few minutes, but the intensity of those moments created something that would be talked about for days to come. Two powerful men, each convinced of their own righteousness, had collided head-on, and neither was willing to back down. As the studio crew scrambled to figure out what to do next, as producers rushed around in panic, and as George finally sat back down in his chair looking dazed, one thing was crystal clear. This was not how anyone expected the morning to go. What was supposed to be a simple talk show appearance had exploded into a fierce battle of wills, ending with Eastwood's dramatic exit and George left to pick up the pieces of a segment gone horribly wrong. The last image, captured by the cameras, was George Stephanopoulos sitting alone at his desk, the empty chair across from him, a stark reminder of how quickly a conversation can spiral out of control when two strong personalities refuse to bend.